He couldn't read a single note. So why were the best musicians in Los Angeles suddenly afraid to play the wrong one? The question had followed Michael Jackson his entire life, whispered behind control room glass and dressed up as professionalism. If he can't write it, can he really know it? On a long, exhausting afternoon in the spring of 1982 at Westlake Recording Studios in West Hollywood, someone finally said it out loud, and for a few seconds, the entire room stopped breathing. The session had already stretched past reason. Coffee had lost its effect. Engineers were second-guessing levels they normally set in their sleep. One track from what would become Thriller refused to land. Not broken, not bad. Just wrong in a way only one person in that room could hear. Michael stood in the center, still but not calm, eyes fixed on nothing, one hand tapping a pulse that didn't quite match the playback. He wasn't listening to the speakers anymore. He was listening to something underneath them, something the room couldn't access yet. That was the problem, and the pressure, because when Michael heard a flaw, he didn't accept close. He chased the exact sound in his head until it existed in the world, or the session broke trying. Around him sat players who could sight read anything. Decades of experience, Grammys, perfect pitch, clean execution on the first take. They were used to being the ceiling. Today they felt like they were standing under one. Then Gerald Okermeyer, an orchestrator with a reputation for turning vague ideas into full scores overnight, closed his folder, looked up, and asked the question with surgical calm. "Michael, you don't read notation, correct? So when you say the strings need to change in the bridge, what exactly are you hearing?" It was a fair question. It was also a trap. If Michael couldn't translate his idea into the language these musicians lived in, then everything stalled. For a heartbeat, the room leaned toward doubt. A chair creaked, someone swallowed, a pencil slipped from a stand and hit the floor with a soft click that sounded too loud. Michael didn't flinch. He looked at Gerald the way you look at a puzzle you're glad someone finally handed you. "Give me a second," he said. He didn't go to the piano, didn't reach for the console. He stepped into the open space between the stands, where nothing hides you, and stood perfectly still. One breath, two. The room held with him. Then he moved, barely, and the sound came out. First, the bass, low, precise, alive, not an imitation. A line with weight, ghost notes tucked between beats, a tack placed exactly where it needed to land. The bassist felt it before he understood it. His body leaned forward on instinct, like he was hearing his own instrument from the inside out. Michael didn't stop. He stacked the rhythm guitar on top. Tight, muted chops, quick releases, accents flickering between the grid like sparks. His shoulders cut invisible strings. The texture was specific, not generic. This guitar, this groove, this moment. Then the drums, mouth, hands, breath. Locking the pocket so clean the drummer's eyes dropped to his kit, checking it like it might have started playing without him. The room wasn't watching a singer anymore. It was watching a record assemble itself through a human body. And then the strings. This is where it should have fallen apart. It didn't. Michael separated the sections in real time. First violins, second violins, violas, cellos. Each with its own entrance, its own swell, its own emotional arc. He sang the verse like it was already recorded. He built the pre-chorus with rising tension that felt inevitable. And when he reached the bridge, the exact place that had been fighting him, he didn't hesitate. He replaced it. Every voicing, every release. The missing breath in the arrangement appeared as if it had been there all along and everyone else had simply failed to hear it. Gerald's pen was already moving, fast, not capturing an idea, transcribing a finished architecture, no smoothing, no correction, exactly as delivered, because this wasn't direction. It was a score without paper. When Michael stopped, the silence didn't snap back. It lingered, heavier than before, but different, like the room had shifted shape. He looked at Gerald, calm, almost gentle. "That's what I'm hearing," he said. "Does that help?" Gerald didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too clearly. What had just happened didn't fit inside the system he'd spent a career mastering. Around the room, professionals who measured music in charts and notation felt something unfamiliar move under their feet. The man who couldn't read music hadn't approximated anything. He had retrieved it, fully built, fully balanced, from a place no one else could access. And in that moment, without raising his voice, without touching an instrument, Michael Jackson had shifted the hierarchy of the room. The question wasn't, can he explain it anymore? The question was, how many layers of the record was he hearing right now that they still couldn't? The silence didn't end when he stopped. It tightened. Not confusion, recognition. Like everyone in that room had just felt the ground move under a system they trusted for years. Gerald's pen was still moving, faster now, converting what he had just heard into notation with a kind of urgency he hadn't felt in a long time. Because this wasn't interpretation. This was translation under pressure. Across the room, the bassist didn't lean back. He stayed forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on Michael like he was trying to catch the tail of something that had already passed. The drummer exhaled slowly, unaware he had been holding his breath. Nobody spoke first. That was the rule now. Don't break whatever just happened. Then Michael did something small, and it changed everything again. He stepped back into the circle of musicians like nothing unusual had occurred and said quietly, "Let's try it from the top." No speech, no explanation, just direction. And suddenly, the room understood its new job. Not to question, not to translate him into their system, but to meet him where he already was. Gerald handed out the parts exactly as written. No smoothing, no fixing, no polite adjustments that arrangers usually make to help players. Some of the lines looked strange, unusual voicings, movements that cut against instinct. The string leader raised an eyebrow at one passage in the bridge, the exact place that had been broken hours earlier. He lowered his bow slightly and asked, "Who wrote this?" Gerald didn't hesitate. He did. A beat. He sang it. A pause stretched across the section. Not doubt, recalibration. Then the leader lifted his bow again. "All right?" From the top. The count came in, soft, controlled. And then it started. The bass locked first, exactly where Michael had placed it, not a fraction early, not a fraction late. The guitar slid in, tight and clean, hitting the accents with surgical precision. The drums snapped into the pocket, the groove suddenly breathing in a way it hadn't all day. And then the strings entered. For a split second there was resistance, the natural hesitation of trained players stepping into something unfamiliar. Then it clicked. Not gradually, instantly, like a door opening inside the music itself. The bridge lifted, the tension released exactly where it needed to. The air in the room changed with it. You could feel it, not metaphorically, physically. Shoulders dropped, heads tilted, eyes widened. The track wasn't fighting anymore, it was moving, alive. When they hit the final note, nobody spoke again. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't pressure. It was disbelief, the kind that comes after something undeniable. Gerald slowly set his pencil down. Not because he was done writing, but because he needed a second to process what had just happened. He had spent his entire career learning how to translate sound into structure. Years of training. Years of rules. And in one demonstration, a 23-year-old who couldn't read a note had bypassed all of it and delivered a complete orchestral solution faster than most professionals could have written a draft. Across the room, Marcus Webb finally leaned back, shaking his head slightly, a small smile breaking through. Not amusement, respect. "That wasn't imitation," he said under his breath. "That was the record." Nobody disagreed, and that's when the shift became permanent. Because the question that had opened the session, "How do you know what you want?" no longer made sense. The real question now was something else entirely. How far ahead of us is he hearing this? Michael didn't celebrate, didn't acknowledge the shift. He just nodded once, already listening again, already searching for the next imperfection no one else had caught yet. Because for him, this wasn't the moment. This was just one correction in a record he had already finished in his mind. And that realization, that he wasn't discovering the music in the room, he was revealing something that already existed inside him. That's what stayed with them. That's what followed them out of that session. That's what they would talk about years later when they tried to explain what made that album different. But what happened after that track was finished. What that moment became once the album left the studio and entered the world. That's where the story stops being a session story and becomes something much bigger. When the album finally left the studio, the world heard the result, but not the moment that made it possible. In November 1982, Thriller arrived like it had always existed, polished, inevitable, complete. Radios didn't question it. Clubs didn't question it. Millions of people pressed play and felt something they couldn't fully explain, a depth, a space between sounds, a precision that felt alive. But inside Westlake, the people who had been there knew the truth. They hadn't just recorded songs. They had witnessed something being translated from a place no chart, no theory, no formal system could reach. And it changed them, subtly at first, then permanently. Gerald Okereyer went back to his desk after that session with staff paper filled edge to edge, notes he hadn't invented, only captured. He stared at it longer than he needed to, because for the first time in his career, the system he trusted felt incomplete. He had spent years learning how to move from sound to notation. But Michael had started on the other side, inside the finished structure, and moved backward into sound. That direction didn't have a textbook. It didn't have a name. And yet, it worked better than anything he had seen. Across the city, the musicians who played on those sessions carried the same quiet realization. In interviews years later, they would struggle to describe it, not because they lacked words, but because the experience didn't fit inside the words they had. They had worked with prodigies, with perfect pitch, with virtuosos who could sight-read anything placed in front of them. But this was different. This wasn't speed. It wasn't memory. It wasn't even talent in the traditional sense. It was something closer to architecture. Michael wasn't building music piece by piece. He was revealing a structure that already existed, fully formed, layered, balanced, waiting to be heard. And once you saw that, you couldn't unsee it. The industry, of course, told a simpler story. Headlines talked about sales, about hits, about records broken, and numbers that didn't seem real. 66 million copies. The best-selling album in history. The narrative became scale. How big it was. How massive. How dominant. But scale was the least interesting part. Because numbers don't explain why something feels alive decades later. Numbers don't explain why musicians still study those tracks and find details they missed the first 100 times. The real explanation lived in that room, in a moment nobody recorded. A young man standing in open space, eyes closed, pulling a full arrangement out of nothing but breath and instinct, while trained professionals sat in silence and recalibrated what they thought knowing music meant. Michael Jackson didn't read music. He didn't need to, because what everyone else treated as language, he treated as memory, as sensation, as something physical, stored not on paper but in his body, in his timing, in the way he could feel the exact distance between a kick drum and a bass note without measuring it. And that's the part that unsettled people, because it meant the rules weren't wrong. They were just incomplete. There are systems that teach you how to describe music, and then there are people who bypass description entirely and arrive at the result first. That's what Gerald understood when he looked at those pages. That's what the string section felt when that unusual bridge voicing suddenly worked. That's what the drummer realized when the groove locked in exactly where Michael had placed it before a single note was played. And that's why, after that day, no one in that room ever asked him how he knew what he wanted again. The question didn't disappear because it was answered. It disappeared because it no longer applied. Years later, when people tried to define genius, they reached for familiar categories: training, theory, discipline, mastery. All of those mattered. All of them were real. But that afternoon in West Hollywood pointed to something else entirely, a different kind of intelligence, one that didn't need translation, one that didn't need permission, one that existed fully formed before the first note was ever played. And that's why Thriller didn't just succeed, it endured, because it wasn't assembled the way most records are. It was uncovered, piece by piece, layer by layer, until the world could finally hear what had been there all along. So now I'll ask you something, and answer honestly. If you had been in that room, watching a man who couldn't read music guide an orchestra better than those who could, would you have trusted what you knew, or what you just witnessed? And where are you listening to this from right now?